The precinct lobby buzzed with the usual hum of people moving in and out, phones ringing, and voices rising to match the morning's flurry of activity. Maya Brooks took a deep breath before she pushed open the heavy glass door, feeling its weight against her hand. Inside, the air was stifling, thick with the tension of arguments and frustrated sighs that accompanied those who had come to seek help, solace, or, like her, justice. Dressed in a navy blue pantsuit, Maya looked every bit the polished professional. Her hair was tied back into a low bun, a small silver cross hung around her neck, and she clutched a folder filled with the evidence she hoped would underscore her claim. But as she waited, standing beside the bustling front desk, where the receptionist occasionally glanced her way but said nothing, she felt the familiar prickle of doubt creeping in. She wasn't unfamiliar with settings like these. Being the daughter of Senator Elijah Brooks, she'd spent her fair share of time around law enforcement officials, both friendly and those skeptical of her family's activism. Yet today she was here for herself. The night before, an unsettling incident had pushed her to a breaking point. She had been driving back from a friend's house when a police car had trailed her for blocks, its lights eventually flashing. Her pulse quickened even as she recalled it, how the officer had been dismissive, his tone sharp as he'd questioned her reason for being in that part of town, in a tone laced with suspicion. But she had nothing to prove here, she reminded herself. She knew why she was here, and no one, not even the man approaching her with a hint of irritation, would shake that resolve. "Can I help you?" the receptionist finally asked, her expression one of detached boredom as she looked up from her screen. "Yes, I need to file a formal complaint about an officer," Maya said, her voice steady but polite. The woman's eyes scanned her, lingering just a little too long, as if trying to read between the lines of her appearance. She leaned back in her chair, tilting her head in a way that suggested Maya's request was one more item in an endless stream of minor grievances. "Take a seat," the receptionist said, pointing toward a line of worn plastic chairs against the wall. "Someone will be with you shortly." Maya's shoulders stiffened, but she nodded, taking her place among the others waiting. Her fingers tapped on the folder's edge as she scanned the lobby, catching bits of other people's complaints, grievances, and fears. It all felt like background noise compared to the steady rhythm of her own thoughts. This wasn't about her pride, she reminded herself. It was about the principle, the right to drive without feeling hunted in her own city. Minutes turned into almost an hour, and no one had yet approached her. She stood up and returned to the receptionist, keeping her voice calm but assertive. "Excuse me, I've been waiting for quite a while. Is there anyone available to take my complaint?" The receptionist barely looked up this time, her face a mask of exasperation. "We're busy. I've already told you someone will be with you when they can." Maya took a slow breath, her fingers pressing tighter around her folder. She wasn't about to let this slip, not after last night. "I understand, but I believe this matter requires immediate attention. If it's possible, I'd like to speak with the officer in charge." The receptionist raised an eyebrow, giving Maya a look that was half disbelief, half irritation. "The captain is busy with real cases, Filing a complaint doesn't require his attention." "Then can I at least make sure this will be properly documented?" Maya countered, her patience thinning but her composure steady. Her mother had always taught her to keep her cool no matter what. And as much as she felt the urge to raise her voice and demand action, she knew that wasn't the route to take, not yet. The receptionist sighed and finally picked up her phone, dialing a number before muttering into the receiver. Maya couldn't make out the conversation, but a moment later the woman nodded and, without a word, gestured toward a door leading to the back offices. As Maya walked through the door, her heartbeat quickened, but she pushed down the unease. This was just another step toward what needed to be done. A young officer escorted her down a narrow hallway with walls lined with aging plaques and portraits of past captains, their faces frozen in time. At the end of the hall, they stopped at a door with a simple brass nameplate, Captain David Fletcher. The officer knocked twice before pushing the door open, gesturing for Maya to enter. Inside, Captain Fletcher sat behind his desk, engrossed in paperwork, his expression serious but void of any warmth. He didn't look up immediately, and Maya took the opportunity to study him, a middle-aged man with silver-streaked hair and a stern face lined with the hard edges of years on the job. The room itself was neatly organized, with plaques and commendations displayed on the walls, a small American flag on the edge of his desk. "Captain Fletcher," the young officer announced, causing the captain to finally look up. His eyes settled on Maya, flicking briefly over her before he leaned back in his chair. "Thank you, officer," he said dismissively, and the young officer exited, closing the door quietly behind him. Fletcher didn't offer her a seat, but Maya didn't wait for the invitation. She crossed the room and sat down across from him, placing her folder on his desk with a calm confidence she wasn't entirely sure she felt. The captain raised an eyebrow, clearly sizing her up. "And what brings you to my office today, Miss Brooks?" "Maya Brooks," she replied, meeting his gaze evenly. She saw a flicker of curiosity, but he didn't show any sign of recognition. It was clear he didn't know who she was. "And what can I help you with?" Miss Brooks's tone was polite but dismissive, as though he were already prepared to label her concern as trivial. "I'm here to file a formal complaint," she began, choosing her words carefully. "Last night I was pulled over by one of your officers. I was treated with hostility, questioned unnecessarily, and given no legitimate reason for the stop. I believe it was racially motivated." Captain Fletcher's expression shifted ever so slightly, his mouth tightening at the corners. He nodded slowly, as though he were considering her words, but Maya could already see the wall of skepticism building behind his eyes. "Miss Brooks," he said after a pause, "our officers are instructed to maintain the highest standards of professionalism. Are you suggesting this officer acted inappropriately?" "That's exactly what I'm suggesting, Captain," she replied, her voice unwavering. "I felt targeted based on my appearance rather than any legitimate suspicion or cause." He leaned forward, clasping his hands on the desk as he regarded her with a calm, almost patronizing expression. "Look, we get a lot of complaints like this. I assure you, our officers don't pull people over without a reason. Could it be possible that you're misinterpreting things?" Maya felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her tone even. "I'm not misinterpreting anything. I've lived in this city all my life. I know when I'm being singled out." Fletcher's expression didn't change, but she noticed his gaze drop briefly to her hands, where her grip on the folder betrayed a hint of tension. "We have a rigorous system of checks and balances here," he said, his voice adopting a bureaucratic monotony. "Our officers are trained to assess each situation carefully. If you felt uncomfortable, I'm sorry, but these things happen." Maya's patience was waning. She opened the folder, revealing a set of printed photos and documents she had carefully gathered since last night. "I understand that, Captain, but this isn't about feeling uncomfortable. I was targeted without cause, and I want this documented." Fletcher glanced at the papers without interest, his expression remaining impassive. "Miss Brooks, our officers are doing the best they can under difficult circumstances. Crime is high in certain neighborhoods, and sometimes extra caution is necessary. Maybe you were just in the wrong place at the wrong time." Maya felt her chest tighten at the words. Wrong place, wrong time. It was a phrase she'd heard too many times, and one that always seemed to be directed at people who looked like her. "Captain Fletcher, with all due respect, this isn't about place or time, this is about my right to be treated fairly, without suspicion based on my skin color," she said, keeping her voice steady, but with a razor's edge. Fletcher's expression hardened, and his gaze became colder. He leaned back, crossing his arms as though he were done with the conversation. "Look, I appreciate your concerns, Miss Brooks, but this really doesn't sound like anything out of the ordinary. Maybe you're reading a bit too much into this." Maya's pulse raced as she walked out of Captain Fletcher's office, her mind whirling from the cold indifference she had just experienced. Despite her composure, her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her folder tighter, as if holding it any looser would mean giving up entirely. She had come to the precinct with a simple demand that her concerns be taken seriously. Instead, she had been met with dismissive skepticism and an overwhelming sense that the system itself was designed to turn people like her away. She lingered in the precinct's narrow hallway, gathering her thoughts. Perhaps she had come off too strong, or perhaps her frustration had shown through too quickly. Still, every nerve in her body told her that she had been nothing but composed and reasonable. And yet that hadn't mattered. Captain Fletcher's condescending words replayed in her mind. "Maybe you're just reading too much into this." He hadn't even looked at her evidence. For a moment, Maya considered leaving the precinct altogether. But the injustice of the situation weighed heavily on her. If she left now, Fletcher would just check a box, dismiss her complaint, and move on without a second thought. And then someone else would walk through those same doors, experience that same dismissal, and leave feeling the same sense of betrayal. Instead of turning toward the exit, Maya took a steadying breath and headed back to the front desk. The receptionist looked up, clearly surprised to see her again. "Back so soon?" the receptionist asked with a bemused look. "I'd like to speak to someone else," Maya said, a newfound edge in her voice. "I feel that my concerns were ignored, and I'd like this complaint properly documented. This isn't something I can just let go." The receptionist's gaze narrowed, as if weighing how much trouble Maya was worth dealing with. "Listen, Miss Brooks, was it? Captain Fletcher is the one in charge, and he's already spoken with you. If he felt there was no need to escalate your complaint, then maybe it's best if you take it up with." "Then I'll take it up with the department's oversight committee," Maya interrupted, the steel in her voice undeniable. She didn't wait for the receptionist to respond, turning instead to look for the young officer who had escorted her to Fletcher's office. She spotted him in a cluster of officers near the entrance, and she approached him directly. "Officer," she said, catching his attention. He looked at her, then around at his colleagues, his face registering both curiosity and mild discomfort. "Yes, Ma, I am," he replied politely, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I'd like to file a complaint in writing," she said. "Can you direct me to someone who can assist with that?" The young officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing over his shoulder as though he expected Captain Fletcher to appear at any moment. But Maya didn't flinch. She met his gaze firmly, and after a brief hesitation, he nodded, gesturing for her to follow him. He led her to a quieter section of the precinct where a middle-aged officer sat at a desk, engrossed in paperwork. "Sergeant Lindell, this is Miss Brooks," the young officer explained. "She's here to file a formal complaint." The sergeant looked up, a faint sigh escaping his lips as he closed his folder and set down his pen. He studied Maya for a moment before nodding. "Take a seat, Miss Brooks," he said, motioning to the chair opposite his desk. The young officer gave a slight nod and returned to his post, leaving Maya alone with Sergeant Lindell. She sat, and as he reached for a stack of forms, she noticed the weary lines etched into his face, a man who had probably heard every type of grievance and complaint over the years. But something about him seemed different from Fletcher. He didn't radiate that thinly veiled hostility or dismissiveness, though he had a pragmatic edge that spoke of a career entrenched in the grind of law enforcement. "All right, Miss Brooks," he began, handing her a complaint form and a pen. "You can fill this out with as much detail as possible. I'll add it to our record and make sure it's filed properly." "Thank you, Sergeant Lindell," Maya said, relaxing slightly at the prospect of someone actually listening to her. As she began filling out the form, he leaned back, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and mild sympathy. "If you don't mind me asking," he said after a moment, "what made you decide to file a formal complaint? Most people, well, they'd usually prefer to forget unpleasant encounters, move on." Maya paused, her pen hovering over the paper. She looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. "Because it's not the first time, and if it goes unaddressed, it certainly won't be the last. I believe this is about accountability, and that shouldn't be something people can just ignore." The sergeant nodded, absorbing her words in silence as she resumed writing. He watched her for a moment longer before speaking again. "Look, Miss Brooks," he said, his voice lowered as though sharing a confidence. "I've been in this job a long time, and I've seen how things work around here, some good, some not so good. The captain, he's been here even longer than I have, and he's set in his ways. But there are officers here who genuinely care, who want to do things the right way." Maya looked up, her expression softening slightly as she listened to him. "I can't promise any miracles," he continued, "but I'll make sure your complaint doesn't get lost in the shuffle." He held her gaze for a moment before nodding toward her form. "If you want a copy, I can make sure you get one for your records." She felt a wave of relief, though it was tempered by the knowledge that a single complaint form likely wouldn't do much to shake the foundations of an entrenched system. But it was a start, and in that moment she felt a sliver of hope. "Thank you, Sergeant Lindell," she replied. "I appreciate your honesty." He offered her a brief, understanding smile before returning to his paperwork, and as Maya finished writing, a calm settled over her. This was only one step, she knew, but at least it was something. Maya barely had time to gather herself before she found herself dialing her father's number, her heart pounding as she considered what this would mean. She'd always tried to handle things on her own, not wanting to lean on her father's influence. But this situation went beyond a simple complaint. This was about standing up against a system that too often made it impossible for people to get justice. And if anyone could help her bring attention to what was happening here, it was Senator Elijah Brooks. The phone rang twice before her father's familiar, calm voice answered. "Hi, sweetheart," he greeted her warmly, a hint of concern in his tone. "You don't usually call this early. Everything all right?" "Hey, Dad," Maya replied, managing a small smile despite the lingering frustration from her meeting at the precinct. Well, I actually need to talk to you about something important. It's about the police precinct here in town." Immediately, her father's tone shifted, a seriousness settling in. "What happened?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. "Did something happen to you?" She hesitated before diving in, recounting the events from the previous night. Her voice trembled slightly as she described the incident with the officer, the way she'd been questioned as if she didn't belong, and the thinly veiled hostility that had clouded the entire encounter. She went on to describe her visit to the precinct, her encounter with Captain Fletcher, and the cold indifference she'd faced. Senator Brooks listened in silence, his breathing steady but his silence heavy with unspoken anger. When she finished, she could almost hear the gears turning in his mind as he processed everything she had shared. "This is unacceptable, Maya," he finally said, his tone firm. "You shouldn't have to deal with this. No one should. And this Captain Fletcher, it's obvious he has no regard for accountability." Maya took a deep breath, grateful for the support but unsure how far she wanted to push. "I didn't want to bother you, Dad," she said softly. "I thought maybe I could handle it myself, but it's hard not to feel like they're just waiting for me to give up and walk away." "You did the right thing by calling me, Maya," he reassured her. "This isn't just about you. This is about everyone who has ever felt silenced or dismissed in that precinct. If they're treating you this way, imagine how they're treating others." Maya felt a swell of determination at his words, a renewed sense of purpose as she realized the broader implications of her experience. Her father had spent years fighting for justice, tackling issues of police reform and racial inequality at the highest levels. If anyone could help shine a light on this issue, it was him. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her voice steady. "I'll make a few calls," he said, his tone thoughtful. "There's an oversight committee that oversees this precinct's operations. They'll want to hear about this. And I know a few people in the media who might be interested in a story like this. If the precinct isn't willing to hold itself accountable, then we'll make sure the public holds them accountable." A shiver ran through Maya as she considered the impact of his words. She'd seen firsthand how effective her father could be when it came to fighting for change. If he was committed to making this a public issue, then Captain Fletcher and his precinct wouldn't be able to hide behind their indifference any longer. "Thank you, Dad," she said, her voice soft but full of gratitude. "I didn't want to bother you, but I'm glad I did." "Anytime, sweetheart," he replied, his voice warm again. "This is what family is for. And remember, you have every right to demand respect and accountability. Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise." They ended the call, and Maya felt a newfound sense of resolve as she pocketed her phone. She wasn't just a frustrated citizen anymore, she was a woman on a mission, backed by a force far greater than Captain Fletcher had anticipated. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Captain Fletcher leaned back in his chair, oblivious to the storm that was about to descend. He was finishing his paperwork, his mind already moving on to other matters. But his tranquility was shattered when his phone rang, the sharp tone cutting through the quiet hum of the office. It was his superior, Chief of Police Martin Rivera. Fletcher Rivera's voice was tense, his tone leaving no room for pleasantries. "We need to talk about the complaint you received from Maya Brooks earlier today." Fletcher felt his chest tighten as he processed Rivera's words. Brooks. The name struck a faint chord of recognition, but he couldn't quite place it. He hadn't thought much of Maya's complaint, dismissing it as yet another grievance in an endless parade of minor issues. But something in Rivera's tone told him he'd made a grave miscalculation. "Yes, sir," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Miss Brooks came in earlier, but it seemed like a straightforward situation. I didn't see any need to escalate it." "Did you bother to look into who she is?" Fletcher Rivera's voice was sharp, almost accusing. Or were you too busy dismissing her complaint to consider that she might be someone important? Fletcher's heart sank as realization dawned. Maya Brooks. Elijah Brooks. Senator Elijah Brooks. How could he have missed it? His mind raced, recalling the few details he remembered about the senator, a powerful figure known for his advocacy for racial justice, someone who didn't take kindly to mistreatment or discrimination. I wasn't aware, sir, he stammered, feeling a pang of dread as he considered the implications of his oversight. I didn't realize she was the senator's daughter. Well, now you do, Rivera said, his voice a mixture of frustration and barely concealed anger. And Senator Brooks isn't going to let this slide. I just got a call from his office, and they're not happy. They're looking into every possible avenue for holding us accountable. This could turn into a public relations nightmare. Fletcher felt a bead of sweat trickle down his forehead as he listened to Rivera's warning. He hadn't expected this, hadn't even considered the possibility that Maya Brooks might have connections powerful enough to bring the entire precinct under scrutiny. What would you like me to do, sir, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. For starters, Rivera replied, his tone icy, I suggest you take this complaint seriously. Reach out to Miss Brooks and make it clear that her concerns are being taken into account. And from now on, tread carefully, Fletcher. The last thing we need is a scandal. The line went dead, leaving Fletcher staring blankly at his phone, his mind reeling as he considered his next move. He'd spent years running this precinct, building his reputation as a no-nonsense, by-the-book leader. But now, in a single oversight, he'd managed to place himself at the center of a potentially career-ending storm. The next day, Maya received a call from the precinct. To her surprise, Captain Fletcher himself was on the line, his tone markedly different from the condescension she had experienced during their meeting. Miss Brooks, he began, his voice strained with a forced politeness. I wanted to reach out to you directly. I've taken another look at your complaint, and I want to assure you that we are reviewing it with the utmost seriousness. Maya's brow furrowed as she listened, sensing the insincerity behind his words. She knew that his sudden change in tone wasn't due to any newfound understanding or empathy, it was fear. He was afraid of the consequences, of the scrutiny that her father's influence could bring down upon him in his precinct. Thank you, Captain Fletcher, she replied, keeping her voice level. I appreciate you taking the time to look into it. There was a pause on the line, a silence that seemed to stretch as Fletcher struggled to find the right words. Finally, he spoke, his tone begrudgingly humble. If there's anything else we can do to address your concerns, please don't hesitate to let us know. We want to ensure that everyone feels safe and respected in our city. The words rang hollow in Maya's ears, but she kept her composure, unwilling to let him see how little his apology meant to her. I'll be in touch if anything else comes up, she replied, ending the call with a sense of grim satisfaction. Fletcher's apology might have been empty, but it was a small victory nonetheless, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. As the days passed, Maya watched with a mixture of pride and trepidation as her father's campaign gained traction. Media outlets began to cover the story, shining a light on the issue of racial bias within the precinct. Public pressure mounted, and soon the city's leaders were calling for an investigation. For Fletcher, the scrutiny was unrelenting. Every aspect of his leadership was examined, his past decisions dissected in search of evidence of bias. His colleagues began to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with the scandal that now surrounded him. And Maya, though shaken by the experience, felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had come to the precinct seeking justice, and while the fight was far from over, she knew that her stand had resonated beyond what she had initially hoped. Calls and messages poured in from strangers, some sharing their own stories of mistreatment, others offering support, expressing admiration for her courage. She'd wanted to push back against a system that too often ignored people like her, and now, it seemed, she wasn't standing alone. Days passed in a blur of interviews, meetings, and messages from community leaders who rallied around her cause. The local press was relentless, digging up data on complaint rates at the precinct, examining patterns, and analyzing Captain Fletcher's track record. Reporters covered the story not just as Maya's personal fight, but as a symbol of a larger issue that had remained under the surface for too long. Meanwhile, Maya's father worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Senator Brooks knew how to amplify a message, using his connections and years of experience to keep the spotlight fixed on the precinct. He met with local officials, leveraging his influence to initiate formal reviews, pushing for changes in how complaints were handled. For every public appearance Maya made, sharing her story with poised calm, her father was in the background ensuring those in power could not simply dismiss her. The attention became impossible for Captain Fletcher to ignore. When he arrived at work, he could feel the wary glances of his colleagues and subordinates, people who had once respected his authority but now seemed hesitant, even distrustful. He felt his control slipping as word spread that the city council was considering a vote on new police oversight measures. Every aspect of his work was under scrutiny, and it only took a few days for a formal investigation into his precinct's complaint handling practices to be launched. For Maya, the sense of progress was invigorating but sobering. She hadn't set out to dismantle the precinct's reputation or to see Captain Fletcher personally face consequences. Yet, as the investigation unfolded, she realized that her experience might finally open the door to real change. Fletcher's casual dismissal, she saw now, wasn't unique to her. He had created a culture within his precinct that allowed countless other complaints to go unanswered. If this process could bring that to light, then the discomfort, the exhaustion, and the anxiety would be worth it. One evening, after a day packed with interviews, Maya sat with her father over dinner, reflecting on the whirlwind of events. Senator Brooks watched her with a mixture of pride and concern. "I don't think I've ever seen the public this invested in one of my cases," he said, smiling softly. "You've struck a nerve, Maya. People want to see this change." She nodded, feeling both the weight and the thrill of her role in it all. "It's strange, Dad. I went there to file one complaint, just one. And now, it's turned into something I never expected." Her father reached across the table, resting a hand on hers. "Change doesn't happen overnight, and it's not easy. But you've already made more of an impact than most people make in their lifetime. You've started something, and no matter what happens with Fletcher or the precinct, you should be proud of that." The next day, Maya received word from the mayor's office. They wanted to meet with her personally to discuss her experience and her thoughts on how the complaint process could be improved. It was a small but significant step forward, and as Maya walked into City Hall, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had her father's support, the backing of her community, and the power of a story that resonated with so many others. It was more than she had imagined, and she was ready to keep pushing, knowing that she was on the right side of history. In the days following her meeting with the mayor, Maya's story continued to gain traction. What had started as a local controversy spread across social media, drawing the attention of national outlets and civil rights organizations. People in neighboring communities began to ask questions of their own police precincts, while community leaders organized forums to discuss issues of racial profiling and accountability. It was a groundswell of voices, and Maya's name was at the center of it. Senator Brooks leveraged the momentum to meet with city council members, urging them to pass a bill that would increase oversight of police precincts across the city. He spoke passionately about the need for accountability and transparency, framing Maya's experience as part of a broader issue that could no longer be ignored. For the council members, many of whom were facing re-election, supporting the bill seemed like the only logical move. By the end of the month, they had scheduled a formal vote on police reform measures that would include independent review boards for each precinct. For Captain Fletcher, the situation was spiraling out of his control. Every day he faced new criticisms and growing pressure to publicly acknowledge the mishandling of Maya's complaint. He tried to keep a low profile, staying out of the precinct whenever possible, but the whispers and sideways glances from his staff reminded him that he was at the center of a storm. He could feel his authority slipping as he watched the department around him begin to question his leadership. Even some of his closest allies were distancing themselves, wary of being associated with the scandal that now had implications far beyond their precinct. One morning, Fletcher received a memo summoning him to a private meeting with the city's chief of police, Martin Rivera. Rivera's office was on the top floor of City Hall, a sleek, modern room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the skyline. Fletcher felt a twinge of anxiety as he stepped off the elevator, sensing that this conversation might be a turning point. Rivera greeted him with a tight smile, gesturing for him to take a seat across from his desk. The chief's usually calm demeanor was strained, his posture stiff as he adjusted a stack of papers in front of him. "Captain Fletcher," he began, folding his hands on the desk, "I won't sugarcoat this. The department is under intense scrutiny, and your precinct is at the center of it. This situation has become a liability, and it's clear that the public is demanding accountability." Fletcher shifted uncomfortably, the reality of Rivera's words settling heavily. "I understand that, Chief," he replied, trying to keep his tone steady. "I know the situation has escalated, but I didn't expect this level of reaction. I was simply following procedure." Rivera's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze unyielding. "Procedure," he echoed, a note of disbelief in his voice. "Fletcher, this isn't about procedure. This is about public perception, about trust. And right now, the public sees our department as biased and unresponsive. That's not something we can dismiss as just following procedure." Fletcher felt his defenses rise, his mind racing to find a way to justify his actions. "With all due respect, Chief, I didn't think Miss Brooks's complaint was credible. In my experience, there are plenty of grievances that end up being exaggerated." Rivera's expression hardened, and he leaned forward, his tone cold and unyielding. "And that's the problem, Captain. You didn't think. You didn't even consider the possibility that her complaint was valid. And now, because of that, we're facing a citywide scandal. The council is voting on new police oversight measures. And the mayor's office is demanding answers. This isn't just a slap on the wrist. Fletcher, this is your career on the line." The weight of Rivera's words hit Fletcher with a brutal clarity. He had thought he could ride out the storm, assuming the attention would eventually shift to some other issue. But now, confronted with the reality of his actions, he could feel his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. His pride had blinded him to the consequences, and now he was paying the price. Rivera paused, letting the silence stretch before he spoke again. "We'll need a public statement acknowledging the mishandling of Miss Brooks's complaint," he said, his tone final. "You'll issue an apology, and we'll be conducting a full internal review of the complaint handling process at your precinct." Fletcher's stomach churned, the humiliation of the situation gnawing at him. He nodded, barely able to meet Rivera's gaze. "Understood, Chief." As Fletcher left Rivera's office, the weight of his impending statement hung heavily on his shoulders. He had always seen himself as a man of authority, someone who commanded respect. But now he was reduced to a scapegoat, his career at the mercy of a single complaint. Meanwhile, Maya continued her work with community leaders and activists, sharing her story and advocating for change. She attended public forums, met with youth groups, and spoke at churches, her voice steady and passionate as she recounted her experience. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about everyone who had felt silenced, dismissed, or marginalized by a system that was supposed to protect them. Her father's influence remained a powerful asset, and together they organized a town hall meeting where community members could share their own stories of mistreatment and discrimination. The event was packed, with people spilling out of the doors, their voices filling the room with a palpable energy. Maya listened, sometimes with tears in her eyes, as people recounted their struggles, their frustrations, and their hopes for a more just future. During one of these meetings, a young man approached her, his face tense with emotion. "Thank you for speaking up," he said, his voice trembling. "I had a similar experience a few months ago, but I didn't have anyone to turn to. I felt like no one would listen." Maya placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, meeting his gaze with empathy. "You're not alone," she replied softly. "We're all in this together, and as long as we keep pushing, things will change." The young man nodded, his expression softening as he found a glimmer of hope in her words. Maya knew that this movement was about more than just her story. It was about giving people like him a voice, a chance to be heard in a world that too often ignored them. As the vote on police oversight drew closer, the pressure on the precinct intensified. Public opinion was overwhelmingly in favor of reform, and even some of Fletcher's colleagues quietly supported the measures, recognizing the need for greater accountability. Fletcher's forced apology had done little to quell the outrage, and many felt that more drastic steps were necessary to address the systemic issues within the department. Finally, the day of the vote arrived, and City Hall was packed with reporters, activists, and citizens eager to witness the outcome. Maya sat beside her father in the front row, her hands clasped tightly as she listened to the council members debate the proposal. Each argument, each passionate plea for change, felt like a small victory, a testament to the power of her voice and the resilience of her community. When the final vote was cast, the council announced the approval of the oversight measures. The room erupted in applause, and Maya felt tears of relief and gratitude well up in her eyes. She hugged her father, overcome with emotion as she realized the magnitude of what they had achieved. Outside City Hall, a crowd had gathered, waiting anxiously for news. As Maya stepped out, she was met with cheers and applause, people calling her name, reaching out to shake her hand, to thank her. In that moment, she felt a profound sense of connection, a realization that her fight had become a catalyst for something much larger than herself. As she walked through the crowd, she spotted Sergeant Lindell from the precinct standing off to the side, watching her with a small, approving smile. He gave her a respectful nod, and Maya returned it, grateful for the unexpected ally she had found within the precinct. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that real change would require continued vigilance and perseverance. But for the first time, she felt a true sense of hope, a belief that the future could be different, that justice was within reach. And as the crowd surrounded her, their voices rising in solidarity, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was just the beginning, and she was ready to lead the way. The vote's passage had sent a shock-wave through the precinct, and Captain Fletcher felt it as acutely as anyone. The oversight measures were already being implemented, with independent review boards established to investigate complaints and ensure transparency in officer conduct. It was as if the foundations of his command were shifting beneath him, eroding the authority he had once wielded with confidence. As he paced his office, Fletcher struggled to grasp the extent of the changes. He'd spent over 20 years building his reputation, enforcing the rules with a strict, often harsh approach, believing that unwavering discipline would keep his precinct running smoothly. But now, with every phone call, every report that crossed his desk, he could feel his control slipping away, one complaint at a time. He glanced at the stack of paperwork on his desk, a growing pile of reports from the new review board requiring his attention. Each report chronicled an incident that had been flagged for potential misconduct, incidents he might have once handled with a simple dismissal. Now, each case demanded his scrutiny, and it was clear that any misstep could jeopardize his position further. The final blow came that morning. As he sifted through his emails and saw a notification from Chief Rivera's office, Fletcher was to issue a statement at a public forum organized by the city council. His job wasn't simply to enforce the new policies, but to endorse them publicly, to stand before the community he'd long presided over and acknowledge the changes with a smile and an open invitation for oversight. The thought gnawed at him, the humiliation of admitting to what he'd spent his career denying. When he arrived at the precinct, he saw that his officers were already talking, murmuring among themselves in hushed voices as he walked past. Some offered him sympathetic nods, others avoided eye contact altogether. The whispers grew louder when he passed, the familiar sounds of loyalty giving way to doubt and scrutiny. It was a feeling he'd never experienced before, and it cut deep, sharper than he'd anticipated. At the same time, Maya was emerging as a powerful figure within her community. With the passage of the new reforms, her name was on everyone's lips, and she was invited to attend public events, forums, and even some televised debates on police accountability. For Maya, the attention was both inspiring and overwhelming. She had set out to file a single complaint, but now she was being hailed as a symbol of courage, her voice amplified by people from all walks of life who shared her dream of a more just society. As the days went by, she became a focal point for community meetings, a figure that activists and citizens alike looked to for inspiration and guidance. Her father watched with pride as she carried the mantle of leadership, aware of the strength it took for her to stand in the spotlight, her story now a beacon of hope for those who had once felt voiceless. One evening, as she prepared for a town hall forum, Maya felt a mixture of nerves and determination settle over her. The hall was packed with people eager to hear her speak, from activists to everyday citizens who had come to listen and share their own stories. It was a humbling sight, and Maya took a moment to breathe, to center herself before stepping up to the podium. When she began speaking, her voice carried a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She recounted her experience with the precinct, the indifference she had encountered, and the resolve that had driven her to keep pushing for justice. The room was silent as she spoke, her words striking a chord with people who had long harbored similar grievances but had never felt empowered to voice them. "I came to that precinct because I believed in the system," she said, her voice steady. "I believed that I could file a complaint, that my concerns would be heard. But instead, I was met with indifference, dismissal. And it was only through perseverance and the support of all of you that my voice was finally heard." The audience erupted in applause, a sound that echoed off the walls, filling the hall with a sense of unity. Maya felt a surge of pride, a realization that her journey had not been in vain. The fight was far from over, but this moment, this gathering of voices and spirits was proof that change was possible, that they were all part of something larger than themselves. In the back of the room, Senator Brooks watched his daughter with pride. He had seen her grow from a quiet child into a strong, determined woman, and in that moment he knew that her voice was exactly what the world needed. Her story was proof that the system could be challenged, that justice was within reach, if only people were brave enough to demand it. As the forum continued, Fletcher's forced apology came up in questions from the audience, with many viewing it as insufficient, a hollow gesture in response to public pressure. Maya addressed the concerns diplomatically, emphasizing that while Fletcher's words might have been forced, the actions now being taken were a step forward. It was a careful balance, and Maya handled it with grace, her calm demeanor serving to unite rather than divide. Meanwhile, Fletcher was preparing for his own appearance. The City Council's public forum would be held in 2 days, and he was expected to deliver a formal statement acknowledging the department's commitment to the new oversight measures. He would face the very community he had dismissed and see their faces as he was held to account. When the day arrived, Fletcher entered the City Council chamber with his head held high, though his insides churned with a mixture of dread and resentment. The room was packed, with council members seated in the front and community members filling the rows. He spotted Maya and her father near the front, their expressions a mixture of steely resolve and quiet satisfaction. As Fletcher stepped up to the podium, he felt the weight of their eyes on him. He cleared his throat, taking a deep breath before beginning his statement. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady though tinged with unease. "As the captain of this precinct, I have always strived to uphold the highest standards of professionalism and integrity. However, in light of recent events, I must acknowledge that we have room to improve, and that our handling of complaints must be approached with greater transparency and fairness." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. His gaze met Maya's for a brief moment, and he saw a flicker of defiance in her eyes, a reminder of the strength that had brought them to this moment. "It is my responsibility to ensure that every member of our community feels heard, respected, and protected," he continued, forcing himself to maintain a tone of humility. "We are committed to implementing the new oversight measures, and I pledge to work alongside the review board to address any concerns that may arise." The crowd remained silent, their expressions unreadable, as he concluded his statement. Fletcher felt a wave of relief wash over him as he stepped away from the podium, though he knew the silence was more condemning than applause. He returned to his seat, feeling the scrutiny of the audience bearing down on him, a reminder of the power they now held. Maya, meanwhile, felt a sense of closure. Fletcher's words might have lacked genuine remorse, but the commitment to oversight was what mattered. The community would have the tools to hold him accountable, and that, she realized, was the true victory. The power had shifted, and it was now in the hands of those who had once been silenced. As the forum ended, Maya found herself surrounded by supporters, people thanking her, congratulating her, expressing their admiration. Her father pulled her into a hug, his pride unmistakable as he whispered words of encouragement in her ear. "You did it, Maya," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You've shown the world what it means to stand up for justice." Maya smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. She had come to the precinct seeking answers, and though the journey had been difficult, she had found something far more powerful: her voice. And with it, she had ignited a movement that would continue to ripple through the community, challenging the systems that had once seemed unchangeable. As the council forum concluded, Maya left City Hall feeling an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. She walked alongside her father, their steps echoing off the marble floors as they made their way toward the main entrance. People stopped to thank her, patting her shoulder, offering handshakes, and even snapping photos. She hadn't fully realized until now how deeply her story had resonated, how her actions had ignited a fire for justice that had been simmering in the community for years. When they reached the steps outside, a crowd of supporters waited, and a round of applause erupted as Maya emerged. She felt a wave of emotion, humbled and empowered, as she greeted them with a grateful smile. Her father's hand rested on her shoulder, and she drew strength from his presence, grateful that he'd been by her side throughout this entire journey. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "This victory belongs to all of us. Together we've shown that change is possible, that our voices matter. But this is only the beginning. We need to stay vigilant, to keep pushing for accountability and fairness. We have the power to make our community a safer place for everyone. And we're not going to stop now. The crowd's applause grew louder, the energy electric as people cheered and shouted words of support. Maya felt tears prick her eyes, her heart full as she looked out over the sea of faces young and old, from all backgrounds united by a shared vision for a better future. She knew that the fight was far from over, but for the first time she felt hopeful that lasting change was within reach. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Fletcher was dealing with the fallout of his public statement. As he returned to his office, the hollow silence of the precinct echoed in his mind, each desk and bulletin board a reminder of the authority he'd once held unquestioned. Now everything felt different, strained, tentative, as though the foundations of his world were cracking beneath him. The next morning, Fletcher called an emergency meeting with his officers. His voice lacked the sharp, commanding tone they were used to, replaced by a weariness that many of them hadn't seen before. He addressed them, sharing the department's plan to integrate the new oversight measures, stressing the importance of adhering to the new procedures. But as he spoke, he could see the doubt in their eyes, a flicker of hesitation that hadn't been there before. Among the officers was Sergeant Lindell, who watched Fletcher closely, his face unreadable. Fletcher had noticed Lindell's quiet support of Maya during the council forum, the nod of respect he'd given her. And while Fletcher hadn't openly questioned Lindell's loyalties, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing his grip on the respect he'd once commanded. After the meeting, Lindell approached Fletcher, his gaze steady. "Captain," he began, his voice calm but firm, "I understand the challenges we're facing, but I think it's important that we address these complaints with sincerity. Dismissing them only breeds resentment, and we can't afford to lose the trust of our community any more than we already have." Fletcher tensed, his pride bristling at the sergeant's words, but he kept his composure. "Sergeant Lindell," he replied, his tone measured, "I appreciate your input, but I'm well aware of what's at stake. We have a responsibility to keep order, and that means maintaining discipline within these walls." Lindell nodded, his expression unwavering. "Understood, Captain. But I'd argue that discipline without accountability is a dangerous thing. We're here to protect and serve the community, and if that means holding ourselves to a higher standard, then that's exactly what we should be doing." Fletcher didn't respond, instead turning back to his paperwork with a tight nod. But Lindell's words lingered, an uncomfortable truth that he couldn't entirely dismiss. For years he had prided himself on his strict leadership, but now he was beginning to realize that perhaps he had been enforcing loyalty rather than integrity. In the weeks that followed, Maya became deeply involved in the development of the new review boards. She worked closely with local leaders and city officials, advising on policies that would improve transparency in the complaint process and ensure that each case was handled with respect and fairness. It was an exhausting process, but Maya poured herself into the work, driven by the conviction that this was her chance to create real, meaningful change. One evening, as she wrapped up a long meeting at City Hall, she received a call from a local journalist who had been covering her story from the beginning. Maya, the journalist, began, his voice full of warmth. "I wanted to let you know that the City Council has just approved the final draft of the review board policies. They're crediting you for much of the framework that was adopted. You've done it, this is going to make a difference." Maya felt a swell of pride, a smile spreading across her face. "Thank you," she replied, her voice full of gratitude. "I couldn't have done this alone. There were so many people who supported me, who believed in this cause. I'm just glad we're finally being heard." She ended the call, her heart brimming with gratitude as she reflected on how far she had come. Her single complaint had sparked a movement, her voice resonating in places she had never imagined. And now, thanks to the combined efforts of her community, the system that had once silenced her was changing from within. At the precinct, the changes were palpable. Officers underwent mandatory sensitivity and de-escalation training, and the new review board representatives began to hold regular meetings to discuss cases flagged by the public. The atmosphere within the precinct shifted as the officers adapted to the new procedures, some with reluctant acceptance, others with open support. Fletcher watched these changes unfold, feeling the authority he had once held slipping further out of his grasp. But what he couldn't deny was that there was a noticeable improvement in community relations. Complaints were being handled more efficiently, and for the first time, community members felt comfortable voicing their concerns without fear of dismissal. One afternoon, Fletcher received a call from Chief Rivera. The tone in Rivera's voice was uncharacteristically warm, as if he were reaching out with a sense of relief rather than criticism. Captain Fletcher Rivera said, "I've been reviewing the feedback from the community regarding the oversight board. It seems like things are finally moving in a positive direction. I hope you understand the importance of what we're doing here." Fletcher hesitated, his pride wrestling with the truth he had been forced to confront. "Yes, Chief," he replied quietly. "I'm beginning to see that." After the call, Fletcher sat alone in his office, his gaze drifting to the photos and commendations lining his walls. He had once seen these symbols as the measure of his success, his legacy. But now he felt the weight of them in a different way, realizing that his true impact would be determined not by his past accolades but by his willingness to adapt, to let go of the rigid ideals that had defined his career. As Maya reflected on the past months, she knew that the fight for justice was far from over. The reforms were a crucial first step, but she understood that the work would require continued vigilance. Her story had been a catalyst, a spark that ignited the community's desire for change. And now that responsibility was hers to carry forward. One evening, she attended a community gathering organized by local activists. As she stood before the crowd, she felt a deep sense of pride and humility, recognizing the power of collective action, the strength that came from uniting for a shared purpose. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she told them, her voice resonant with conviction. "But together we've proven that we can make our voices heard. We've shown that justice isn't just an ideal, it's a commitment, a promise we make to one another." The room erupted in applause, the energy vibrant and hopeful. Maya knew that this was her calling, her purpose. She had found her place within her community, a voice that would continue to advocate for justice, equality, and accountability. As the evening wound down, she spotted Sergeant Lindell in the crowd, his face illuminated with a look of admiration and respect. He approached her, offering a handshake. "You've done something remarkable here, Maya," he said, his voice full of genuine warmth. "You've changed the way we see ourselves and the way we approach our work. Thank you for that." Maya smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. She had come to the precinct months ago, seeking a simple acknowledgement of her experience, but she had gained something far more profound. She had ignited a movement, inspired a community, and begun a journey that would leave an indelible mark on the city. As she left the gathering, walking into the cool night air, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for justice, she knew, was a lifelong commitment. And she was ready to face it, knowing that she was not alone, that her voice would continue to echo through the lives of those she had inspired. As Maya's influence continued to spread, her story took on a life of its own. National news outlets picked up the narrative, positioning her as a beacon of resilience and change. Invitations to speak poured in from advocacy groups and conferences, and her social media following ballooned with supporters from across the country who connected with her message. Yet, despite her newfound visibility, Maya stayed rooted in her community, focused on ensuring that the recent reforms took hold. The success of the review board set a precedent for nearby cities, and soon, other municipalities began to examine their own complaint processes, inspired by Maya's journey. Her name became synonymous with accountability and empowerment, a voice that reminded people they had a right to demand respect and justice. But as her influence grew, so did the pressures that came with it. One evening, as Maya prepared to address a gathering of community leaders, she received a call from her father. His voice carried a note of concern, and she could tell he had something on his mind. "Maya, I just wanted to check in," he began, his tone thoughtful. "You've been doing an incredible job, but I want to make sure you're taking care of yourself too. This level of attention, it can be exhausting." Maya smiled, touched by his concern. "Thanks, Dad. I know it's a lot, but I feel like I'm finally making a difference. This work, it's more than just a fight for justice. It's a chance to help people see that they have a voice, that they can make a change." Her father sighed, a mixture of pride and worry evident in his voice. "Just remember that change is a marathon, not a sprint. Don't burn yourself out trying to solve everything all at once." "I know, Dad," she replied, her voice softening. "But after everything we've been through, I can't just sit back. People are listening now, and I need to keep pushing forward." They ended the call, and as Maya entered the hall where the community meeting was taking place, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The room was filled with faces she recognized, people who had supported her from the beginning, friends and neighbors who had become her allies. As she stepped onto the stage, she felt the weight of their expectations, but also their unwavering belief in her. She began her speech by recounting the journey that had brought them to this point, from the initial complaint she had filed to the reforms now in place. She spoke passionately about the importance of transparency, the power of community, and the responsibility they all shared in holding each other accountable. "We have come so far," she said, her voice resonant with conviction. "But this is only the beginning. Each of us has a role to play in ensuring that these reforms are upheld, that the voices of our community are always heard. Together we've shown what's possible when we stand united. And I promise you, we're not going to stop now." The crowd erupted in applause, their energy filling the room with a sense of unity and purpose. Maya's heart swelled with gratitude, knowing that she was part of something much larger than herself. This was no longer just her story, it was a movement, a collective vision for a more just and equitable future. While Maya's influence soared, Captain Fletcher struggled to find his footing amidst the changes reshaping his precinct. The oversight board was now a regular presence, reviewing cases and examining practices that had gone unchecked for years. Fletcher's role was slowly diminishing, as decisions he once made unilaterally were now subject to the scrutiny of external reviewers. The authority he had taken for granted was slipping through his fingers, replaced by a level of oversight that made him feel like a stranger in his own precinct. It didn't take long for Fletcher's frustration to reach a breaking point. One afternoon, after a particularly tense review meeting, he confronted Sergeant Lindell in the hallway, his expression dark and stormy. "Do you think all of this is necessary, Lindell?" he demanded, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. "Do you think these so-called reforms are actually helping us do our job? Or are we just being shackled by outsiders who have no idea what it takes to keep the city safe?" Lindell held his ground, his face calm as he met Fletcher's gaze. "Captain, I think accountability is a necessary part of our job. The community trusts us to protect and serve, and that trust has to be earned. If oversight is what it takes to restore that trust, then I support it." Fletcher's jaw clenched, his frustration boiling over. "Maybe you do, Lindell, but I don't think you understand the toll this is taking on morale. We're supposed to be leaders, not pawns in some political game." Lindell's expression softened, but his voice remained steady. "Captain, respect is a two-way street. If we expect the community to respect us, we have to show them that we respect them too. That's what Maya's fight was about, and that's what these changes represent." Fletcher shook his head, unwilling to concede. "You think this is about respect, Lindell? It's about control. They're stripping us of our authority, turning us into public servants instead of officers." For a moment, Lindell said nothing, his gaze thoughtful. Finally, he replied, "Maybe that's exactly what we should be, public servants. Because without the support of the people we serve, all the authority in the world won't mean a thing." The words hung in the air, and Fletcher felt the sting of their truth. He knew deep down that Lindell was right, but admitting it felt like a betrayal of everything he had built his career on. With a dismissive wave, he turned and walked away, his mind racing as he grappled with the reality he had tried so hard to avoid. Despite Fletcher's reluctance, the reforms began to take root, gradually reshaping the precinct's relationship with the community. Complaints were now addressed with a level of transparency that had once seemed unimaginable, and officers were held to a standard that emphasized fairness and respect. Maya watched these changes with a sense of pride, knowing that her efforts had paved the way for a more accountable system. One afternoon, Maya was invited to speak at a panel discussion on police reform, alongside other activists and officials from across the state. The event was held at a local university, and the auditorium was packed with students, journalists, and community members eager to hear from those at the forefront of the movement. As Maya took her seat on stage, she felt a surge of excitement, her heart racing as she prepared to share her journey with a wider audience. The discussion was lively, with panelists sharing stories of challenges and victories, the struggles and triumphs that came with pushing for change. When it was Maya's turn to speak, she took a deep breath, her voice calm and clear as she addressed the crowd. "What we're doing here is about more than just policy," she said, her gaze steady. "It's about rebuilding trust. It's about creating a system that values every voice, every experience. because at the end of the day, our communities deserve to feel safe and respected, and that starts with accountability. The audience listened intently, nodding in agreement as her words resonated. Maya felt a wave of gratitude, knowing that she was part of a movement that was inspiring people far beyond her own city. Meanwhile, Fletcher's struggle continued. The oversight board's regular meetings became a source of dread, each review a reminder of the control he had lost. He spent his days haunted by the realization that his career was no longer his own, that the authority he had once wielded with pride was now subject to scrutiny. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, Fletcher found himself reflecting on the choices that had led him here. He remembered the early days of his career, when he had joined the force with a sense of purpose, driven by the belief that he could make a difference. But somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of that purpose, consumed by the need to enforce order rather than foster trust. For the first time, he wondered if Lindell had been right, if perhaps he had misunderstood what it truly meant to serve. The thought unsettled him, challenging the rigid beliefs he had clung to for so long. But as the silence of the empty precinct pressed in around him, he felt a stirring of doubt, a quiet voice urging him to reconsider. In that moment, Fletcher knew that he faced a choice: he could continue to resist the changes, holding on to his authority with clenched fists, or he could open himself to the possibility of growth, of learning what it meant to lead with humility rather than control. Taking a deep breath, Fletcher made a decision. He would meet with Lindell the following morning, not as his captain but as a fellow officer, someone willing to listen and learn. It was a small step, but it felt like the beginning of something new, a chance to reclaim the integrity he had lost, to redefine his legacy. As the first light of dawn crept over the city, Fletcher found himself hopeful for the first time in weeks. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but he knew that he was ready to face it, to rebuild the trust he had taken for granted. Months had passed since the initial reforms were enacted, and the precinct was no longer the same place it had once been. The atmosphere was lighter, though more disciplined, as officers adapted to the new standards. Training sessions on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation had become routine, and the oversight board had established a rhythm, reviewing complaints and ensuring each case was handled with thoroughness and respect. The community's trust, which had once felt like a fragile illusion, was beginning to rebuild, piece by piece. Maya continued to work tirelessly, her role as a community leader solidified with each passing day. The sense of accomplishment was deeply fulfilling, yet she remained vigilant, well aware that maintaining change would be an ongoing process. Her presence was a constant reminder of accountability, and she met regularly with the oversight board, offering feedback and addressing concerns from the community. She wasn't just a symbol, she was an active participant in the evolution of the system she had once challenged. One afternoon, Maya received an unexpected call from Sergeant Lindell, who invited her to a small gathering organized by the precinct. It was intended as a gesture of goodwill, a way for the officers to thank her for her dedication and to acknowledge the progress they had made together. Though initially hesitant, Maya accepted, understanding that this was an opportunity to further bridge the gap between the community and the officers who served it. When she arrived at the precinct, she was met by Lindell, whose warm smile put her at ease. He led her to a conference room where several officers had gathered, along with a few community leaders who had supported Maya's journey. She was surprised to see Captain Fletcher among them, his expression guarded but respectful. "Thank you for coming," Maya Lindell said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "We wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the impact you've had here. These changes wouldn't have happened without your persistence." Maya nodded, her gaze sweeping over the room, noting the mixture of expressions, some grateful, others contemplative. She understood that not everyone was entirely comfortable with the new structure, but she appreciated the effort they were making to engage in the dialogue. As the meeting unfolded, Fletcher spoke up, his tone subdued but sincere. "Miss Brooks," he began, avoiding her gaze momentarily before meeting it with a flicker of humility. "I wanted to personally apologize for how I handled your complaint. I was wrong to dismiss you, and I see now the importance of the reforms you've championed. They've made us better." The words, though quiet, felt momentous. Maya acknowledged his apology with a nod, feeling a sense of closure. Fletcher's journey had been one of resistance, but in this moment she saw a man who was beginning to understand the value of humility, the strength it took to acknowledge mistakes. It was a reminder that change was possible, even in the most unlikely places. As time passed, the new oversight measures gained traction, with other precincts and departments in neighboring cities adopting similar policies. Maya's influence continued to spread, her story a testament to the power of resilience and community. She was invited to speak at universities and conferences across the country, her voice amplifying the importance of accountability and transparency in law enforcement. Through her efforts, people from all walks of life found inspiration, a sense of empowerment that transcended borders and backgrounds. Yet, despite her national recognition, Maya remained dedicated to her community. She organized monthly forums where citizens could voice their concerns, ensuring that the communication between the precinct and the community remained open and honest. These gatherings became a symbol of healing, a space where people could share their experiences, both positive and negative, and work toward solutions together. One evening, after a particularly powerful forum, Maya was approached by a young girl, no older than 13. She had been listening intently throughout the session, her eyes wide with admiration. As she stood before Maya, she hesitated, as if gathering the courage to speak. "Maya," she began, her voice quiet but determined, "I want to be like you when I grow up. I want to help people and make things better." Maya felt a wave of emotion, a sense of pride mixed with humility. She knelt down, meeting the girl's gaze. "You already have the strength to make a difference," she said gently. "All it takes is courage and the belief that your voice matters. And if you ever need help, I'll be right here to support you." The girl beamed, and in that moment, Maya saw the impact of her work reflected in a new generation. She understood that the seeds she had planted would continue to grow, that her journey had inspired others to stand up and make their voices heard. Meanwhile, Fletcher's journey continued, marked by a slow but steady transformation. He became more involved in the new training sessions, often sitting in on cultural sensitivity workshops and de-escalation exercises. At first, he had attended these sessions out of obligation, but gradually he began to engage more actively, asking questions, listening to the experiences of others, and reflecting on his own biases. One day, during a training session on implicit bias, Fletcher found himself paired with Lindell for a role-playing exercise. The goal was to practice handling tense situations with empathy and understanding, and Lindell played the role of a frustrated citizen with a complaint. As the exercise unfolded, Fletcher felt a surge of discomfort, a realization of how he had once dismissed complaints without fully listening, assuming he knew the answers before hearing the questions. But Lindell's portrayal forced him to confront that tendency, challenging him to approach the interaction with patience and respect. After the session, Fletcher pulled Lindell aside, his expression thoughtful. "I never realized how much I missed by assuming I already understood people's concerns," he admitted. "I thought discipline was enough, but now I see that it has to be balanced with empathy." Lindell nodded, a smile of encouragement on his face. "It takes strength to see things from a new perspective, Captain. This work isn't easy, but the more we understand each other, the better we can serve." Fletcher left the session feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He had begun to view his role not just as a position of authority, but as an opportunity to foster trust, to rebuild the bonds between the precinct and the community he had once overlooked. As Maya's reforms continued to strengthen the precinct, the community began to see tangible improvements. Complaints were addressed promptly, officers became more engaged with residents, and neighborhood events were organized to foster positive interactions. What had once been a climate of mistrust was gradually becoming one of mutual respect and collaboration. Maya watched with pride as the community she loved grew stronger, more united. The monthly forums continued to serve as a platform for open dialogue, and over time, the attendance grew. Officers attended voluntarily, listening to community members' concerns and offering updates on the precinct's efforts to address them. One evening during a forum, a man stood up to share his story. He spoke of an encounter he'd had with the police years ago, one that had left him feeling angry and marginalized. But now, he said, he felt hopeful, grateful for the progress he'd seen within the precinct. "I never thought I'd live to see the day when our concerns were actually heard," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But thanks to people like Maya and to the officers who are here today, I can finally say that I believe in the change we're building together." The room erupted in applause, and Maya felt a sense of fulfillment, unlike anything she had ever known. This was what she had fought for, not just policy changes, but the restoration of trust, the healing of wounds that had festered for too long. After the forum, Fletcher approached her, his demeanor humble yet respectful. "Maya," he said, his voice steady, "I want to thank you for everything you've done. I didn't understand it at first, but I see now that this was never about tearing us down, it was about building something better. And I'm grateful to be a part of it." Maya smiled, extending her hand. "Thank you, Captain. It means a lot to hear you say that. I know it wasn't easy, but your willingness to grow has made all the difference." They shook hands, a gesture of respect that symbolized the journey they had taken from adversaries to allies, united by a shared commitment to justice and community. In the months that followed, Maya continued her work, collaborating with other cities to implement similar reforms. Her story inspired a wave of change, as communities across the country began to advocate for oversight and accountability in their own precincts. She became a sought-after speaker, sharing her journey with audiences who saw in her a beacon of hope. Yet, despite the growing recognition, Maya remained grounded in her community, committed to the people who had supported her from the beginning. The precinct had become a model of transparency, a place where citizens felt valued and respected. And while the journey had been difficult, Maya knew that every step had been worth it. One evening, as she walked through her neighborhood, Maya looked around at the familiar faces, the streets she had always called home. She felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that the change she had fought for was not just a fleeting victory, it was a foundation, a promise that the community could continue to build upon. And as the sun set over the city, casting a warm glow over the precinct that had once felt so distant, Maya knew that her journey was far from over. There would always be work to do, voices to lift, and injustices to confront. But she was ready, her heart full of gratitude and resolve, her spirit unbreakable. This was her purpose, her legacy, a life dedicated to justice, to community, and to the unwavering belief that every voice mattered.